Married Pryce stood in the morning light of her cabin, hands chalked permanent white from lime, studying the rafters above with the eye her father had taught her. It was late September 1877, and she had just come down from the scaffolding in Dr. Erasmus Penhaligon's new house on the North Ridge, having spent the final hours checking the finish coat with a trowel and a felt block, reading the surface for any imperfection. The last coat of her finished plaster was hardening. The three-coat system she had learned at her Tad's Hawk and Trowel in Carmarthenshire, back when she was 12, and her father still moved across the interior of the Morriston Chapel ceiling, as though he were dancing, understanding through his hands the language of plaster and lath and time. That was when the world was lime putty and oak lath, and the slow, careful mathematics of carbonation, when her hands first learned to read the set of mortar through their fingertips, to know by touch whether the lime had reached the point of plasticity where it could receive the trowel. She was the daughter of that knowledge, the inheritor of his craft and his discipline. Her father, Owain Pryce, had been a master plasterer, a plastrwr of the old Welsh tradition, the kind who kept his ratios in a leather-bound book that smelled of horse glue and river damp. That book sat now on her kitchen shelf, its pages filled with his writing in Welsh and English both, diagrams of hawk angles and trowel pressures, notes on the slaking of quicklime and the proper length of horsehair for suspension in the matrix. He had taken her through each ceiling as an apprentice might take a master. Watch the hawk, feel the tension of the mortar in the trowel, know when the scratch coat wants to set before you score it. Listen to the wood. The wood will tell you if the lath is riven true. The lung disease took him in the spring of 1871, when she was still in her 20s, still believing that good work and careful hands could hold against time. She had his trowels, Liverpool-steel, hand-forged, worth more than most families kept in cash, and his book and the knowledge that 3 coats of lime and horsehair, properly done, would last longer than any of them. The emigration had come in the spring of 1872, when she was 26. Rhys, her husband, a carpenter of steady work and quiet ways, had heard from his cousin in the Wyoming Territory about silver and coal booming in a place called Carbon Springs, not yet 3 years old, building fast, needing timber framers. They had taken ship from Cardiff and arrived in Cheyenne with 2 trunks and her father's tools. The quarter section claim that Rhys filed lay 7 miles east of Carbon Springs, where the sage rolled brown and the elevation was high enough that winter came hard. It was honest land. They had meant to stay there, to build something that would outlast the silver fever. The rockfall took him in the autumn of 1876, 4 years after they had arrived. It was September, and he had been working as a timber setter in the Sweetwater colliery, reinforcing the galleries where the coal seams had shifted. A prop of new timber had failed. Later they said it had been green wood, unseasoned, and the foreman had pushed the men too hard and too fast. Rhys had been one of 3 that the rock took. She had buried him in the cemetery on the south bench, the one that had burned over in the sage fire the summer before and had to be rededicated. She had no heirs. She had his quarter-section claim, which the territorial law allowed her to hold, and she had her skills, and she had his tools added to her own. Through the winter of 1876 and into the spring of 1877, she had existed in a kind of quiet suspension, splitting wood, hauling water, maintaining the cabin while the drifts came and went. It was the trowels on her shelf that reminded her that she was still herself, still someone's daughter, still the kind of hand that knew how to hold the world together with lime and horsehair. In May of 1877, she had walked into Tubbs Hardware and Mercantile on Main Street to purchase hand-forged lath nails. She had come to commission the riving of oak, enough for a small cottage ceiling, but she needed the nails first, long enough to penetrate through the lath and bite into the joists, small enough not to split the riven wood. She had come in at mid-morning, when the light was good and the hardware man had time to talk. Instead, Cornelius Tubbs himself had been at the counter, a man of 56, red-faced from prosperity and railroad wealth, owner of the Mercantile, alderman of Carbon Springs, shareholder in the coal company. He had looked at her with the practiced eye of a man who saw everyone as a customer or not a customer. When she had asked for the lath nails, he had smiled. "Welsh, are you?" he had said, his accent the flat American accent of a man born in Ohio and raised on commerce. "Born in Carmarthenshire," she had answered in careful English. "My husband was from Denbighshire." "Well," he had said, "if you're looking to plaster a ceiling, let me show you something modern, something American." He had walked her to the back of the store, where he had stacked pressed tin ceiling panels, each one stamped with an ornate design, each one silvered with tin plate that caught the light like a mirror, the finish bright enough to make a man squint. "6 cents a square foot from Sears, Roebuck," he had said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man who had discovered a profitable business model. "I sell them for 22 cents installed, and they're fireproof as well as modern. Your old lime work is Welsh fanciness. No American needs that anymore. No American wants it." He had gestured at the panels with a salesman's proprietary hand, his confidence absolute. "These are the future. Your father's craft is over." She had been quiet for a moment. She had been thinking of the chapel ceiling at Morriston, how her father's three-coat work had stood for 60 years, how the chapel record book had noted in 1864 that the plaster was still in perfect condition. She had been thinking of the chemistry of carbonation, how quicklime, when exposed to the air, draws carbon dioxide back into its structure and becomes stone again, harder than concrete, lasting centuries. She had been thinking of the horsehair in the mortar, the long strands that hold a plaster system together through thermal shock and settling, and the 1,000 small stresses of a building's life. "No," she had said, "I need the nails." He had sold her the nails without speaking further, but he had not looked at her after that, and she had understood that she had made an enemy of a powerful man. It was a thing she would have to carry with her through the town. The summer of 1877 was when Dr. Erasmus Penhaligon had come to her. He was a man in his late 50s, trained in Edinburgh, who had come to the territory for his health, for the high clear air, for the dryness, for the sense that here a man could still build something. He had bought a lot on the North Ridge and commissioned a house, 6 rooms, 14-foot ceilings in the main reception spaces. When he had learned from the lumberman that Married Pryce, widow of the carpenter Rhys, was the one who had asked for oak riven true, he had walked out to her quarter section and found her splitting shingles on a frame. "You're Welsh," he had said. "I am. You know the old plaster, the lime work." "I do." He had studied her for a long moment. His eyes were gray and thoughtful. "My grandfather's house in Perthshire had a ceiling done in the lime tradition. The plaster was 200 years old and still perfect. I remember my father showing me how you could scratch the surface and see clear lime all the way through, no gypsum, No shortcuts. I've been wanting to know if that craft was still alive anywhere. He had paused. I want that work on my ceiling. Every room, top to bottom. Can you do it? She had quoted him a price. $14 per 14 by 16-foot ceiling, materials and labor included. That was a fair price, perhaps even generous to him. He had agreed without haggling. The work had begun in late June. She had slaked quicklime on site in a wooden tub, the heat rising from the slaking so intense that the wood had steamed and the surface of the water had bubbled. She had covered the tub with wet burlap and left it to mature under water for 28 days, while the exothermic reaction of hydration consumed itself in the darkness. The lime putty had become soft and cream-like, developed a faint sweet smell like river stones ready to receive the sand and horsehair. She had hauled sand from the south fork of the Sage Creek in burlap sacks, the sharp-washed creek sand, well graded, the kind that would grip the lime particles and hold them in suspension through the full cure, through the drying and the carbonation and the years beyond. She had beaten horse mane and tail hair through the mortar in batches, 12 barrels over the summer, the hair working into the lime sand mix until each trowelful contained a three-dimensional network of fiber that would hold the plaster matrix intact through any settling or thermal shock. The work was rhythmic and exhausting. She would stand at the edge of the barrel with a wooden paddle, driving the horsehair deeper and deeper into the paste, feeling the resistance of the fibers, knowing when the distribution was even. The riving of oak lath had taken 2 weeks of careful work. She had worked with a lath riven who owed her a favor, splitting fresh oak lengthwise into pieces 1 1/4 inches wide and 5/16ths thick. These pieces she had nailed to the ceiling joists with the hand-forged nails, spaced so that there was a 3/8 inch gap between each lath, a key gap. The plaster would squeeze through that gap and form mechanical keys on the back side, locking the entire ceiling to the joists as though it were poured concrete. She had verified each gap with her thumb, checking that the spacing was true, that the nails were driven home, that nothing would shift or move when the weight of the plaster came to bear. The first coat, the scratch coat, Renzu in Welsh, had gone on in mid-July. She had troweled 5/8 of an inch thick, pushed hard to drive the mortar through the key gaps and form those mechanical locks on the back side. After 4 days, when the surface had become leather hard but not yet fully set, she had scored it with a wire comb, creating a mechanical key for the second coat to grab. She had let it rest 7 days in the dry territory air. She spent those days resting, checking other tasks, preparing materials for the next phase. The second coat, the brown or Rendwer canal, had come in late July. 3/8 of an inch thick, rotted flat with a 6-foot straight edge, the surface brought to a true plane, the work requiring steady pressure and the reading of light across the plaster to detect any hollow or any irregularity. She had used the straight edge to feel for soft spots, had knocked hollow areas with her knuckles to find where the plaster had not bonded properly. Another 14-day rest while the lime began its slow crystallization and hardening. The finish coat, Gorfiniad, had gone on in September. 1/8 of an inch of pure lime putty combined with marble dust and water, no sand, no hair, polished smooth with a trowel and a felt block until it gleamed like pale stone. Total thickness from the oak lath to the finish, 1 1/8 inches of lime and horsehair matrix. The entire system was now ready to cure for months, hardening as atmospheric carbon dioxide penetrated the plaster and recrystallized the lime into stone. Dr. Penhaligon had walked through his house in late September and had wept. "It's like being under a sky," he had said, looking up at the ceiling, his face lifted to the finished plaster as though to rain. "It's like the chapel of my childhood. It breathes. You can feel it breathe." Merritt had understood what he meant. The plaster, when properly done, was not inert. It had a faint luminosity to it, a quality of life, because the limestone itself was porous and alive, exchanging moisture with the air, adjusting to the changes in the air's humidity. The finish coat had a slight texture, not rough, but not perfectly smooth. That caught the light differently, depending on the angle, making the ceiling seem to change throughout the day. He had paid her in full without haggling. He had also begun to refer her to patients, to families in the town who wanted better than the thin lime and gypsum work that itinerant plasterers from Cheyenne sometimes rushed through. By the end of October 1877, she had 3 more commissions, and the knowledge had spread through the town that there was a Welsh woman on the quarter section who understood the old work and could make ceilings that would last. In 1878, the work had multiplied, 6 houses across the town in a single season. She had brought in help, a girl named Catrin Owens, 16, daughter of a Welsh miner, strong-backed and willing to learn the old craft. Merritt had trained her in the mixing, in the beating of hair through the mortar, in the reading of set times and temperatures, in the feel of the trowel as it moved across the surface. Catrin had proven apt, quick to understand the principles, capable of managing the physical work without complaint. The girl had the same instincts that Merritt recognized from her father's teaching, an ear for the sound of the mortar as it mixed, an eye for the proper consistency of the lime when it reached the right plasticity, hands that could sense through the paddle when the hair had been beaten sufficiently. By autumn, the 2 of them had moved between the scaffolding with an easy rhythm, Merritt on the trowel and Hawk, Catrin managing the mortars and the hair supply and the maintenance of the slaking pits. They worked in comfortable silence, understanding each other's movements, anticipating each other's needs. Merritt found that her solitude was less absolute, her burden lighter for the sharing of it. This was when Cornelius Tubbs had struck. He had written a letter to the editor of the Cheyenne Rocky Mountain News, published in December 1878, declaring that Welsh ceiling fraud was being perpetrated in Carbon Springs, that the old lime work was a fire hazard, that pressed tin ceilings, modern, American, fireproof, should be required by town ordinance for all new construction. He had used the word fancy work, an old-world obsession, and had suggested that only ignorance kept anyone buying the tradition when modern science had proven the superiority of tin and pressed steel. The letter had caused some attention in the town, and Tubbs had made sure to read passages from it aloud in the Mercantile. The town council had called for a debate in January 1879. Dr. Penhaligon had testified. He had brought with him the chemistry, plain language, no fussiness. He had explained carbonation, how quicklime, when exposed to carbon dioxide in the air, recombines into calcium carbonate, which is limestone again, harder than concrete, stronger than the hour it was mixed. He had explained the fire performance, that lime plaster, when exposed to heat above 600 degrees Fahrenheit, released its water of crystallization, an endothermic reaction that absorbed approximately 1,500 British thermal units per pound, cooling the backside of the plaster and preventing the fire from dropping through. He had explained that horsehair, even when subjected to direct flame, did not ignite but rather charred slowly, holding the matrix together as the lime beneath it performed its thermal duty. He had then explained what happened to pressed tin. At 600 degrees, it begins to warp, he had said. At 700 degrees, it buckles. At 800 degrees, it falls. He had paused. When it falls, the fire enters the space below. Every lamp, every piece of furniture, every textile ignites at once. That is not fireproof. That is an accelerant with a tin face. The ordinance had been put to a vote. It had failed on a tied vote. Tubbs had been furious, his red face becoming darker, his hands clenching on the table before him. He had stalked out of the council chamber without speaking to anyone. Nevertheless, in July 1880, he had announced a grand renovation of Tubbs Hardware and Mercantile. He had removed the old wooden ceiling, the plain board and batten that had served the store since its opening, and had installed a new ceiling entirely in pressed tin. The panels were stamped with a pretentious design involving eagles and stars, and they had been burnished to a high shine. Across Main Street, spanning from one corner of the building to the other, he had hung a banner in letters 4 feet tall, "Modern American." Maird had not come to see it. She had been occupied in late July with the tea-room ceiling at the Hartwell Saloon, a beautiful space with tall windows and good light, where the railroad surveyors and the town's better class gathered for coffee and conversation. She had done that ceiling in 3 coats, lime and horsehair, and it had set properly, curing through the dry July and August. She had not remarked on Tubbs's banner. Katrin had told her about it, how Tubbs had stood beneath it with his arms crossed, watching the town pass, seeming to expect congratulation or deference. Maird had simply nodded and continued with the next ceiling. On the night of October 14th, 1880, at 11:14 in the evening, the chimney at the Hartwell Saloon caught fire. It was a dry autumn, no rain in 22 days, the relative humidity at 18%, a 30-mile-per-hour wind out of the southwest. The chimney had accumulated creosote from a season of cottonwood burning, a thick varnish of flammable residue from the burning of resinous wood, and the temperature of the flue had climbed above the ignition point. Flames had leapt up the exterior of the brick stack with a sound like a great exhalation and had thrown embers across the roof in a shower of sparks. The wind had carried those embers northeast, directly across Main Street, where they had scattered like burning seeds across 23 buildings, the flames following the drift of ember like a hunter following a scent. The Hartwell itself had caught first, flames racing up the false front and into the attic spaces. The adjacent block of wood-frame structures had ignited in sequence. The livery barn had gone. The surveyor's office, 3 residential buildings of board and batten construction, fuel dry in the October heat. At 11:48, an ember had landed on the roof of Tubbs Hardware and Mercantile. The fire had found its way through the wooden shingles and into the attic space above the pressed tin ceiling. The heat had climbed. At 11:57, the metal panels had begun to warp. At exactly midnight, the buckling had begun, the panels curling upward as the metal expanded with the heat. At 12:20, the first panel had fallen inward, dropping directly onto the lamp oil and turpentine stored on the shelves below. The oil had ignited. The store had become a furnace. By 1:30 in the morning, nothing remained but the brick chimneys and the framework of the front door, standing like a tombstone in the firelight. Tubbs's loss was $4,800. He had no insurance. At 1:08 in the morning, an ember had lodged in the cedar-shake roof of Merritt's cabin. She had been awake. Most of the town was awake. The orange light of the fire bright enough to read by, the wind carrying the sound of flames and the crack of timber giving way. She had smelled the smoke, then the specific smell of her own cedar beginning to char. She had climbed down from the loft and climbed immediately back up into the rafters, pulling herself through the smoke-thick darkness toward the spot where the ember was working. She had 2 pails of water. She had brought them up with her, one in each hand, hauling herself through the fire-lit murk until she could see the glow in the cedar. She had dashed the first pail on the rafters, on the joists, on the cedar shakes themselves, soaking everything within reach. The second pail she had held in reserve. The heat was terrific, the smoke thick and choking, the wind pushing air through the gaps in the roofing and feeding the ember like a bellows. Around her, through the gaps in the roof, she could see the town burning. The Hartwell saloon brilliant with flame, the hardware store a furnace, buildings collapsing into their own embers. The noise was tremendous. But here, in this loft with her cabin below her and her own work holding, she worked methodically, without panic, the way she had been taught to work. But the ceiling below, the ceiling that she had plastered herself, 3 coats deep, lime and horsehair, the complete system that she had installed in this cabin when she and Rhys had first claimed the quarter section, that ceiling held. The fire could not drop through. The lime was absorbing the heat, releasing its water of crystallization, the endothermic reaction cooling the backside of the plaster and preventing the flames from penetrating downward. The horsehair in the matrix was charring black, but it was not burning. It was holding, the 3-dimensional network of fiber maintaining the integrity of the plaster system, even as heat raged above it. By dawn, the embers had burned themselves out. The rafters were charred and scorched, but they were still standing. The cabin was still standing. The interior rooms were cool. Nothing beneath the ridge had ignited. When the light came clear enough to see, she climbed down and inspected the ceiling from below. There were scorch marks on the finished plaster, dark streaks where smoke had run down the sides of the interior walls, but the plaster itself was intact. Not a single crack, not a single separation where the adhesion had failed. The 3-coat system had held. She walked outside into the cold morning air and looked at the town. The Hartwell saloon was ash and brick, the tea-room ceiling gone. The hardware store was gone, the modern American banner burned away. The surveyor's office was rubble. 17 buildings had burned. 2 people had been taken. A family caught on the wrong side of the flames near the schoolhouse. The town was devastated, smoking in the gray dawn light, the smell of burned timber and charred leather hanging over the street. But there was something else. Among the burned and ruined buildings stood 4 others that had taken embers on their roofs but had not burned inside. The doctor's house on the North Ridge, the Methodist parsonage, the Welsh Congregational Chapel, and a residential building on the south side of Main Street that belonged to a miner and his wife. All 4 of these buildings had taken fire on their roofs. All 4 of them had marred ceilings inside. The roofs had burned. The rafters had charred. But the fire had not dropped through. The interiors had been saved. At 9 in the morning, Cornelius Tubbs walked to her door. He was a man who had lost everything. The hardware store was gone. The inventory was gone. His reputation as the merchant who could provide modern fireproofing was ash. His wealth, so carefully accumulated through the markup on pressed tin panels, had been reduced to nothing by the fire. He was holding the brim of a borrowed hat in both hands, the crown of his head exposed, something in the gesture of absolute humility. He did not apologize in words, but his eyes, when he looked at her, were the eyes of a man asking forgiveness from a height he could not measure. "Will you plaster my rebuild?" he said. She looked at him. "Every ceiling, top to bottom," he continued. "3 coats deep, hair throughout, the lime work. Whatever you charge, I'll pay it." She named her price. It was double what she had charged before, though still not excessive given the scope of work. Tubbs's storefronts, the residential apartment above, the storage rooms, there were perhaps 45 ceiling squares to complete. At $20 per square, the work would be nearly $900, the largest commission she had ever received. "Yes," he said, "I'll pay it all." The rebuild consumed the winter of 1880 and the spring of 1881. Mar had worked with Catrin and with 2 additional helpers, Welsh cousins who had answered her letter and come from Carmarthenshire to learn the American work and to help with the growing commissions. The cousins were strong men, brothers named Gwyn and Thomas Davies, and they brought with them the same understanding of the craft that Merritt's father had taught her. They had learned from their own plasterer in Carmarthenshire, so there was no need for extensive instruction. They spoke the language of the craft, understood the ratios and the timing, could read the set of a plaster coat without instruction. By April, the hardware store was ready, and Tubbs walked through with her, looking up at the ceilings, running his eye along the transitions and the details. The rebuild had taken more than 2,000 barrels of mortar, more than 3 tons of lime putty, and the better part of 4 months of continuous work in the cold months. They had slaked 6 separate batches of quicklime, each one matured separately to ensure the proper putty quality at each stage. The work had been meticulous and demanding. He did not say the work was beautiful, but he hired her to plaster the next 3 buildings that he developed: a new general store, a boarding house, and a row of storefronts. And when travelers came through Carbon Springs and asked him about the plaster work on Main Street, he recommended her by name, speaking of her as he would have spoken of a master builder in any city in the East. Within 2 years, half the commercial buildings in the town had 3-coat lime and horsehair ceilings. The pressed tin system disappeared from the building plans. The fire of 1880 had taught the town what chemistry and horsehair could hold against, and they had learned the lesson thoroughly. What had been shame became source of pride. The Welsh ceiling, the traditional work, the system that had stood test of flame and time. Maird continued on her quarter-section claim. She had proved up her title to the land in the summer of 1879, taking her widow's right and filing the final papers at the territorial office. The claim was hers in perpetuity, the little cabin and the quarter-section of sagebrush and high grass land where she and Rhys had meant to build something lasting. Now it was the home of the master plasterer, the place where the lime was slaked and the hair was beaten and the old knowledge was preserved. Catrin married a Welsh miner named Evan and established her own shop, plastering buildings in Laramie and beyond. The 2 cousins from Carmarthenshire set up as independent contractors, teaching the tradition to other young people who wanted to learn the old mathematics of lime. By the time Maird was 40, in the mid-1880s, the tradition was established enough to endure. The limestone quarries to the north began to supply slaked putty to plasterers across the territory. The craft that Owain Pryce had passed to his daughter was now rooted in American soil, growing from the fire and the holding on. In 1883, a surveyor's wife from back east wrote a letter to her brother in Philadelphia, describing the excellence of the lime plaster work she had seen in the territory, and the letter was printed in a technical journal. Within a year, men had come from Denver and Cheyenne to study Merritt's work and to commission samples. She had become the known master of the craft in Wyoming. She kept her father's leather-bound ratio book on the shelf of her cabin. She added to it, noting the specifics of American materials, the variations needed for the high dry altitude, the differences in how Wyoming oak lath behaved compared to the oak of Carmarthenshire. She drew diagrams in the margins. She wrote notes in Welsh and in English. The leather was wearing now, the pages dog-eared from use and the passage of years. When the cousins asked her questions, she would bring them the book and point to the relevant page, and they would understand that this knowledge had come from time and testing and love. The book had become something more than a record of ratios. It was a chronicle of emigration, of craft continuing, of the old ways taking root in new ground. In its pages were the mathematics of Plaster and the memory of Owain, the plasterer of Carmarthenshire, and the proof that careful hands, working patiently in the service of good materials, could hold against anything the world sent down at them. The ceiling in the cabin held through the fire, and so did the memory, and so did the craft, passed from father to daughter, to student, to future generation, 3 coats deep, hair throughout, true and strong.